The 2.5 hours. That is exactly how long it took the United States military to completely dismantle a national air defense grid, breach a sovereign capital city of 3 million people, and snatch a sitting president directly from his own heavily fortified military compound. What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the team room. Grab a seat. If you are new to the channel, let me give you the quick operational brief. I am a retired Special Operations Officer. I spent a couple of decades doing the quiet, heavy lifting for the United States military in places that mostly don't exist on public records. I can't show you my face, and I can't give you my real name because of the non-disclosure agreements I signed at the Pentagon. The military gave me a profound skill set, but it broke my body in the process. So I get a VA disability check, but I am not here to ask for your money. I believe in working for my keep. So here is the deal. I trade you my experience. I give you the raw, classified, unfiltered reality of military operations and tactical analysis. In exchange, I just ask for your engagement. Hit the subscribe button, smash the like button, and drop a comment down below. That feeds the YouTube algorithm, it pushes these videos out, and it allows me to stay independent while doing this. If you can respect that trade, then lock and load. We have a massive mission to debrief today. Today, we are doing a comprehensive, tactical after-action review of Operation Absolute Resolve, the January 3rd, 2026, raid to capture Venezuelan President Nicolás Maduro in Caracas. When you watch the news, an event like this looks like it happened overnight. A sudden flash of violence, helicopters in the sky, and then a press conference in Washington. But to those of us in the special operations community, a direct action raid of this magnitude against a sovereign head of state is the culmination of months, sometimes years, of obsessive, granular intelligence gathering and logistical nightmares. We are going to deconstruct this entire operation. We will look at the invisible cyber and electronic warfare campaign that blinded the Venezuelan military. We will analyze the specific aircraft and Tier 1 units involved. We will uncover the hidden truths about the firefight inside the Fuerteventura compound, specifically the heavy presence of Cuban intelligence operatives who fought and died to protect Maduro. And finally, we will evaluate the mission. We will look at why Operation Absolute Resolve was an absolute tactical masterpiece, but simultaneously, a profound strategic and geopolitical mess. Let us start with the intelligence preparation of the battlefield. You cannot just fly a fleet of helicopters into Caracas. The geography of the city is a nightmare for an aviation assault. Caracas is situated in a deep valley surrounded by the steep mountains of the Cordillera de la Costa. It is an urban jungle densely populated with narrow streets and millions of civilians. But the geography was the least of the military's problems. The real problem was the Russian hardware. Over the last 2 decades, the Venezuelan regime had spent billions of dollars purchasing advanced air defense systems from Moscow. They had an integrated, multi-layered air defense grid. At the long-range tier, they operated the S-300VM anti-2500 system, capable of tracking and shooting down aircraft from over 200 kilometers away. At the medium range, they had the Buckhem-Tui at the short range. For point defense, they had the Pechora 2M and hundreds of man-portable Igla-S shoulder-fired missiles. To fly a slow-moving MH-60 Blackout or an MH-47 Chinook into that environment is suicide. The helicopters would be painted by radar and blown out of the sky before they even crossed the coastline. Therefore, the Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC, realized that before the assault force could move, they needed total, absolute air dominance. The planning for this took place in secure, windowless vaults. The The CIA, the NSA, and the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency built a pattern of life on Maduro. They knew his schedule down to the minute. They knew when he slept, where he ate, and how his security detail rotated. They discovered that his primary residence and command center was located deep inside Fort Tiuna, the Fort Tiuna military complex in the southern part of Caracas. This is the headquarters of the Bolivarian Armed Forces. It is a fortress within a fortress, surrounded by high walls, guard towers, and hundreds of heavily armed soldiers. But intelligence also revealed a critical vulnerability. The inner ring of Maduro's security was not Venezuelan, it was Cuban. For years, the Cuban Intelligence Directorate, the G2, and their elite special forces, the Avispas Negras or Black Wasps, had been embedded in Venezuela. They were there to coup-proof the regime. The Cubans didn't trust the Venezuelan military to not turn on Maduro, so they provided the Praetorian Guard. This meant that the U.S. assault force wouldn't just be fighting poorly trained conscripts. They would be going head-to-head with highly motivated, well-trained foreign mercenaries who knew that if the regime fell, their own survival was on the line. The force package assembled for Operation Absolute Resolve was staggering. This was not a small, quiet raid like the Osama bin Laden mission. This was a massive, combined arms invasion force compressed into a tiny timeline. The staging ground was the Caribbean Sea. The United States Navy positioned an amphibious-ready group led by the USS Iwo Jima, a Wasp-class amphibious assault ship. The Iwo Jima acted as the floating forward operating base. On the flight deck sat the Infiltration Force, the legendary 160th Special Operations Aviation Regiment, the Night Stalkers. They brought MH-47 direct action penetrators and MH-47 Chinooks. The assault force itself was comprised of operators from the 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta Force. The unit. They were supported by operators from the 24th Special Tactics Squadron to handle air traffic control and terminal guidance, and a specialized exploitation team to gather intelligence from the target site. But the real muscle was in the sky. Over 150 aircraft were involved in this operation. Phase 1 of the operation initiated at exactly 100 hours local time. The objective: blind the country. Before a single physical bomb was dropped, United States Cyber Command launched a devastating zero-day cyber attack against the Venezuelan power grid and military communications infrastructure. The lights in Caracas went out. The radar screens inside the Venezuelan air defense bunkers went black, filled with static and false ghost signals. Simultaneously, the electronic warfare aircraft moved in. Navy EA-18G Growlers jammed the entire electromagnetic spectrum. They flooded the enemy communication frequencies with white noise. The Venezuelan commanders couldn't talk to their missile batteries, and the missile batteries couldn't talk to their radars. Then came the kinetic strike. Stealth is the name of the game here. A squadron of F-35 Lightning II fighters flying completely undetected penetrated Venezuelan airspace. Their mission was suppression of enemy air defenses, or SEAD. Within a span of 12 minutes, the F-35s dropped precision-guided munitions, small-diameter bombs, and AGM-88 HARM anti-radiation missiles directly onto the critical nodes of the S-300 and Buck missile systems. They didn't have to destroy every single missile launcher. They just had to destroy the radar vehicles and the command and control trucks. Without the radars to guide them, the massive surface-to-air missiles were just expensive metal tubes. The F-35s also cratered the runways of the primary Venezuelan Air Force bases, ensuring that their Su-30 fighter jets could not take off to intercept the American helicopters. By 1:30 hours, the airspace over Caracas was owned entirely by the United States. The door was kicked open. A Phase 2 infiltration. Lifting off from the deck of the USS Iwo Jima, the Night Stalkers began their approach. Flying a helicopter over the open ocean at night, under night vision goggles with no lights, is a terrifying experience. But these pilots are the best rotary-wing aviators in human history. They crossed the coastline and immediately dropped their altitude. They flew nap of the earth. This means flying just a few dozen feet above the treetops and the rooftops, navigating through the valleys of the Andes Mountains. Flying low prevents any surviving short-range radars from acquiring a lock, and it masks the sound of the rotors until the helicopters are right on top of you. The flight path took them directly into the urban sprawl of Caracas. The city was pitch black due to the cyberattack, but through the four-tube GPNVG-18 panoramic night vision goggles worn by the pilots and the Delta operators, the city glowed in crisp, high-definition green. At 2:01 hours, the heavy MH-47 Chinooks flared and touched down inside the perimeter of the Fuerte compound. Of Phase 3, the assault. The moment the ramps dropped, Delta Force operators flooded the objective. This is where the physics of close quarters battle, or CQB, take over. The operators moved with surgical liquid aggression. They were equipped with suppressed short-barreled rifles, infrared lasers, and advanced body armor. The initial Venezuelan guards at the outer perimeter offered almost no resistance. They were blinded by the darkness, confused by the sudden blackout, and terrified by the sudden appearance of the black helicopters. Many dropped their weapons and fled or surrendered immediately. But as Delta pushed deeper into the compound, moving toward the presidential residence, the resistance stiffened. They hit the inner security ring, the Cubans. The Black Wasps did not run. They had been preparing for this exact scenario. As Delta operators breached the courtyard of the main residence, they were met with concentrated, disciplined automatic weapons fire. The Cubans were using night vision equipment of their own, though inferior to the American hardware, and they had established interlocking fields of fire from the second-story windows and fortified balconies. This is where the tactical supremacy of the U.S. operators shined. They did not get bogged down in a static firefight. When you are on an extraction mission behind enemy lines, speed is security. The 24th SDS combat controllers traveling with the assault force immediately called in close air support. But they didn't use bombs. A bomb would destroy the compound and potentially kill the target. Instead, they called in the AH-64 Apache gunships and the MH-60 direct action penetrators that were circling above in a holding pattern. The helicopters rolled in, using their 30mm chain guns and 7.62 miniguns to lay down devastating, pinpoint suppressive fire on the Cuban positions. The miniguns fire up to 6,000 rounds a minute. It sounds like a giant canvas sail ripping in half. The sheer volume of fire pulverized the balcony positions, shattering the concrete and eliminating the heavy gunners. With the high ground neutralized, the Delta assault teams stacked on the primary entry points of the residence. They used explosive breaching charges to blow the reinforced doors off their hinges. The overpressure from the blast shattered every window in the house. They flowed inside. The interior of the residence was a chaotic maze of smoke, dust, and localized firefights. The operators cleared room by room, executing the lethal geometry of CQB. They didn't shout. They communicated through radio clicks, hand signals, and the visible beams of their infrared lasers cutting through the smoke. Intelligence had indicated that Maduro had a highly fortified safe room built deep inside the central architecture of the building. It featured solid steel blast doors designed to withstand a direct mortar hit. As the Delta teams converged on the central hallway, they saw the remaining Cuban security personnel desperately trying to push Maduro and his wife, Cilia Flores, into the safe room and secure the heavy steel door. The operators sprinted down the corridor. They engaged the remaining guards with surgical double-tap headshots, dropping them instantly. But they were 2 seconds too late to stop the door. The heavy steel vault slammed shut, and the locking mechanism engaged with a heavy metallic clank. Maduro was inside. He was trapped, but he was secure behind 6 inches of ballistic steel. This is where specialized equipment comes into play. Delta Force doesn't just bring guns, they bring industrial tools. The breaching team immediately moved to the front of the stack. They carried exothermic cutting torches, specifically the BROCO tactical torch system. This torch burns oxygen and magnesium rods at temperatures exceeding 10,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It doesn't just cut steel, it vaporizes it. The breacher sparked the torch. A blinding shower of white-hot sparks illuminated the dark hallway. He applied the 10,000-degree flame directly to the locking mechanisms and the hinges of the vault door. The heat was so intense that the operators standing 10 feet away could feel it through their fire-retardant uniforms. Within 90 seconds, the molten steel dripped onto the marble floor. The locking bolts melted into slag. The operators attached a hydraulic spreading tool similar to the jaws of life used by firefighters into the melted gap. They pumped the hydraulics, and with a terrible groaning sound of tearing metal, the vault door was pried open. The flashbangs were thrown into the room. The deafening concussive blasts and blinding light disoriented the occupants. The assault team flooded the safe room. At 2:34 hours, the radio transmission went out to the command center on the USS Iwo Jima and relayed directly to the White House Situation Room. Jackpot. We have the package. Nicolás Maduro and Cilia Flores were zip-tied, hooded, and immediately frog-marched out of the residence. They were surrounded by a phalanx of operators. Phase 4 Exfiltration. Getting to the target is only half the mission. Getting out is where most operations go wrong. The element of surprise was completely gone. The entire city of Caracas was waking up. Sirens were blaring in the distance. The surviving elements of the Venezuelan military were attempting to mobilize, but their command structure was still paralyzed by the cyber attacks and the lack of communications. The Delta operators loaded the high-value targets onto the waiting MH-47 Chinooks. The ramps closed. As the helicopters lifted off from the Fuerte compound, they began taking scattered small arms fire from the surrounding urban neighborhoods. Tracers zipped through the night sky. One of the Chinooks took several rounds to the fuselage, but the heavy armor plating absorbed the impacts. The real danger was shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles. With the main radar grid down, the only threat left was a lone soldier with an Igla missile. As the flight formation banked over the mountains heading toward the Caribbean, missile launch warnings sounded in the cockpits. A thermal bloom was detected on the ground. A missile was in the air. The pilots reacted instinctively. They dropped the collective, diving the massive helicopters toward the terrain to break the line of sight, while simultaneously dumping a massive cloud of infrared flares. The flares burned brighter than the helicopter engines. The incoming missile tracked the flares, veered away from the aircraft, and detonated harmlessly in the sky, lighting up the mountainside. At 4:29 hours, the wheels of the Chinooks touched down on the flight deck of the USS Iwo Jima. The rotors spooled down. In exactly 2.5 hours, the United States had invaded a sovereign country, fought a pitched battle against foreign mercenaries, extracted a head of state, and vanished back into the ocean. Now let us conduct the after-action review. We have to separate the tactical execution from the strategic reality. Tactically, Operation Absolute Resolve was nothing short of a masterpiece. To coordinate cyber, electronic warfare, fifth-generation fighter jets, and Tier 1 rotary, wing aviation into a single, seamless timeline is a feat of logistical genius that no other military on the planet could even dream of attempting. The operation resulted in 0 United States fatalities. A handful of Delta operators sustained minor injuries from shrapnel and debris, but no American body bags came home. The objective was secured exactly as planned. But strategically, politically, this mission is a textbook example of why tactical victories do not always win wars. Let us look at the casualty report that they tried to bury. While no Americans died, the firefight inside the compound was a bloodbath. At least 40 people were killed during the raid. And the critical hidden fact that the Cuban government later admitted was that 32 of those dead were Cuban nationals, the Black Wasps. By killing 36 elite Cuban intelligence and military personnel, the United States didn't just insult Venezuela. We essentially engaged in a proxy shootout with Havana. This severely escalated tensions across the entire Latin American theater. Furthermore, we executed a kinetic strike on a sovereign capital city of 3 million people. We invoked a highly aggressive interpretation of the 19th century Monroe Doctrine, essentially declaring that the United States has the absolute right to physically remove any leader in the Western Hemisphere that we deem a threat. This sent a chilling shockwave through our allies in Europe and across South America. International law was completely bypassed. The United Nations was in an uproar. And what was the actual result on the ground in Venezuela? We took the king off the board, but we didn't flip the chessboard. The infrastructure of the regime remained entirely intact. Within hours of the raid, Vice President Delcy Rodriguez, surrounded by the surviving military high command, went on national television. She declared martial law, swore herself in as the acting president, and used the American invasion to completely unify her fractured political base. We cut the head off the snake, but a new head grew back immediately. The Venezuelan military, which had been wavering in its support for Maduro, suddenly rallied behind the new president in the face of foreign aggression. The economic sanctions remained. The humanitarian crisis remained. We proved to the world that the United States Special Operations Command can reach out and touch anyone, anywhere, at any time. We proved that no bunker is deep enough, and no air defense grid is complex enough to stop Delta Force from knocking on your door. But we also proved that we suffer from a severe lack of day-after planning. As is so often the case,